Listen, that sound isn't just wind. It's a living thing, clawing at the timber walls of the Norse Longhouse. Outside, the night is a fury of white. But inside, you hear the deep groan of ancient construction, a low, wooden creak running through the load-bearing structure above your head. It's the middle of the night, and the heavy snow isn't just falling. It's stacking, layer by wet, crushing layer. You feel the weight in your bones before you even see it. The only light comes from the central fire, a dying glow that makes the shadows of sleeping family members dance against the curved walls. Somewhere in the darkness, a sheep shuffles nervously. An ox sighs. The air is thick with the smell of wool, damp earth, and smoke drifting up toward the turf roof. That roof is your shield. But right now, it's a ticking clock. Every hour piles on more pressure. You can almost hear the fibers in the timber framing compressing, tightening, screaming silently under the load. You lie there, wide awake, doing the grim math. Wet snow weighs 3 times more than fresh powder. A typical longhouse roof spans dozens of feet. The sheer tonnage pressing down through the medieval architecture is staggering. One structural flaw, one weak joint, and the roof collapse would be instant. No warning, just a muffled thud, and then the cold. The smoke drying process hardened the beams. But is it enough? How did these Scandinavian buildings handle the impossible physics of a brutal winter without buckling? To understand that, you have to look at the Norse Longhouse. This wasn't just a building, it was the all-purpose life support system of the Viking world, stretching from Norway's fjords to Iceland's volcanic plains. Picture a low, elongated silhouette with a distinct boat-like curve to its roofline, as if an overturned ship had been pulled ashore and anchored into the earth. The skeleton was pure timber framing, massive pine or birch posts sunk deep into the ground, joined with precise mortise and tenon joints that could flex under wind load without cracking. The walls varied, stout vertical planks or wattle-endured panels that breathed in summer and sealed up tight in winter. But the defining feature was the turf roof. Layer upon layer of thick grassy sod over birch bark, this wasn't decoration. That living mat added enormous dead load. Throw heavy snow on top, the kind of wet maritime snow that doubles weight overnight. And you have a recipe for collapse if the structure wasn't perfectly dialed in. These ancient methods had no modern safety factors. Yet families lived here for generations through hurricane-force winds and 8-month winters. The materials were brutally simple, but the survival secret hid in the design, the material choice, and the daily habits of the people inside. And it was precisely this clandestine cultivation of the mulberry tree and the Bombyx mori silkworm that allowed Constantinople to break the Persian monopoly strangling Mediterranean trade. The story begins with an act of industrial espionage so audacious it reads like myth. According to the historian Procopius, during the reign of Justinian in the mid-6th century, 2 Nestorian monks approached the imperial court with a daring proposition. They had traveled deep into the Ceres lands, modern-day China, and learned the complete life cycle of the silk moth. A creature so thoroughly domesticated it had lost the ability to survive in the wild. Knowing the eggs would perish if shipped by caravan, the monks hollowed out bamboo staves, filled them with precious granular eggs, and walked the entire length of the Silk Road, nurturing the cargo with their own body heat. Upon arrival, the eggs were hatched in controlled incubators and fed exclusively on newly planted white mulberry groves. This single biological coup severed the Sasanian chokehold on raw silk, catalyzing a state-controlled gymnasium within the Great Palace. It was not merely a workshop but an extension of imperial authority, where women known as Kuvuklisii produced the most heavily regulated textile in history. Purple-dyed silks, reserved for the emperor, were soaked in murex snail secretions, their scent of garlic and brine announcing supreme power. Later, the Book of the Eparch forbade any private citizen from owning more than one bolt of unyarned silk, ensuring the fabric remained an instrument of foreign policy. Every diplomatic gift of a silk chlamys to a Frankish king or Bulgar Khan was a calibrated distribution of legitimacy, a shimmering thread binding periphery to center, until the Fourth Crusade shattered the city and scattered its weavers across the Adriatic. Speaking of threads that bind, it's a world away from the harsh winters we're exploring. Hope you're digging this deep dive. Want more ancient engineering breakdowns? Hit like and subscribe to Just Vikings now so you never miss a story about real survival technology. Alright, so you've hit that button. And let's get back inside the Norse Longhouse, right where the magic of medieval architecture happens. We talked about the threads that bind, but now I want you to look at the skeleton. I'm talking about the timber bones that held everything together. The secret wasn't some fancy gadget, it was a raw, overbuilt tree trunk, often fashioned into a cruck frame. Imagine taking a naturally curved, massive oak tree, splitting it down the middle, and using those two halves to create an A shape that goes from the ground all the way to the peak. There's no sitting politely on a wall plate here. These upright posts were connected by a horizontal tie beam, locking the legs together and topped by angled rafters, all joined not with rusting iron, but with wooden pegs that swelled inside their holes for a deadly tight grip. Now, here's where the physics of heavy snow comes into play. You might think a roof pushes outward when loaded, threatening to splay the walls apart. But the Vikings didn't let that happen. Because those massive posts were driven deep into the earth, the crushing weight of the turf roof and winter snow didn't push sideways. It translated straight down. It's a pure vertical load path. The roof pushes down into the post pushes into the ground, and the ground pushes back. The walls were just screens. They weren't load-bearing, so they were never in danger of collapse. For lateral stability, to stop the whole thing from racking sideways in a storm, carpenters relied on cross-bracing and the rigidity of the thick turf itself, which locked the rafters like a solid lid. Was the frame overbuilt? Absolutely. The dead weight of the dry roof materials was staggering, but that mass gave the structure its resistance. A gale couldn't lift it, and a blizzard couldn't shift it. The weight was a feature, a gravity-powered lock holding the house down while smoke from the hearth quietly drifted up, curing the timber day by day. And that lock began with the very first layer, a continuous sheet of birch bark rolled out directly over the rafters. This wasn't just some flimsy wrapper. They harvested massive strips and lapped them like modern roof shingles, each piece overlapping the one below, so any meltwater or driving rain would cascade downward without ever touching the precious timber framing beneath. Birch bark is packed with natural resins, so it resists rot. And when properly layered, it forms a waterproof membrane that seals out moisture for decades. But the genius didn't stop there. On top of that bark went the turf itself, cut from local grasslands in long, rectangular strips. The Vikings didn't just toss sod on and call it done. They constructed a deliberate sandwich. The first layer of turf went down grass side up. Then the next layer was flipped grass side down, so roots and soil knitted together, forming a dense, interlocking mat that resisted erosion. Repeat that 3 or 4 times, and you get a living roof that's essentially a sponge. In a downpour, it could absorb a phenomenal amount of water, slowly releasing it after the storm passed. But here's the real engineering trick. That saturation turned the roof into a deadweight anchor. When fully waterlogged, a single turf roof on a large longhouse could weigh several tons. No gale could lift the edges. No blizzard could shift the ridge beam. In traditional timber framing, you normally brace against uplift. Here, gravity did the job for you. The weight locked every joint tighter. Yeah, the frame had to be a monster from day one. These weren't casual rafters. They were massive load-bearing structures, often spaced closely, with king posts and diagonal bracing carved from straight-grained pine. The entire building was engineered to accept the load, not merely survive it. And because the turf was a living organism, it also served as phenomenal insulation, keeping the Longhouse noticeably warmer in winter and cooler in summer. But that blessing rode on a knife edge. If the bark layer ever failed, or if drainage channels clogged, that same multi-ton weight would saturate the wood, invite rot, and threaten a catastrophic roof collapse. So house maintenance wasn't optional, it was a seasonal ritual. Every spring, you inspected the birch bark, replaced damaged turf strips, and cleared the eaves. A healthy living roof meant winter survival. A neglected one spelled disaster. And all the while, the hearth smoke kept drifting upward through the ridge, slowly curing the timbers in a perfect partnership of fire and earth. That partnership was more deliberate than it sounds. Inside the Norse Longhouse, the central hearth wasn't just for cooking, it was the engine of winter survival. Those flames burned almost constantly for 6 months of bitter cold, sending a steady column of warm, dry smoke spiraling toward the ridge. Instead of trapping it, builders cut a simple louver or left a continuous smoke hole under the peak, and that slight gap became the roof's silent life support. The rising heat conditioned every timber from the inside out, actively drawing moisture from the wood fibers and lower layers of turf that would otherwise stay damp for weeks after a heavy snowmelt. Anyone who's dealt with medieval architecture knows that trapped humidity is the real enemy of load-bearing structure. It invites rot into the timber framing. But here, the smoke created a constant, gentle kiln effect. As the draft pulled through, it deposited an invisible film of creosote and tar-like residue onto the beams. That wasn't messy soot. It was a natural fungicide and insect repellent the Norse didn't sit down to engineer. They simply noticed that houses with constant fires had roof timbers that stayed sound for a generation longer than any sealed-up storage shed. So they preserved the trick by never sealing the ridge tight. In a typical Scandinavian building, what looked like a drafty floor was actually an ancient construction hack, smoke drying the Viking roofs from within, turning a potential roof collapse into quiet, reliable resilience. That smoke drying was only half the battle. The hidden genius lay in how these structures handled water from above. Beneath the thick turf, a layer of birch bark acted like a prehistoric waterproof membrane. It wasn't just slapped on, it was layered carefully so any moisture soaking through the soil would channel down, following the bark's overlapping seams like shingles. All seepage was directed to the eaves, where overhanging turves and beams kicked it clear, preventing rot. The steep pitch of these medieval roofs worked in tandem with that bark slickness, sloughing off the vast majority of rain and meltwater before it ever saturated the turf's full depth. But this system had zero margin for error. If ice dams clogged those eaves, or if a corner of birch bark tore, everything changed. Water would pool, the turf would soak it up like a sponge, and suddenly that load-bearing structure faced a massive weight increase. The roof would begin to sag, trapping more water, and the failure accelerated. Drainage wasn't just maintenance, it was a matter of life and death, a constant vigil against the slow, wet pull of gravity that could turn a Norse longhouse into a tomb. And here's the unvarnished truth they don't put in the glossy documentaries. That roof didn't survive because it was a perfect, static engineering marvel. It survived because it was watched. It was a living, breathing, decaying thing, and every adult living under it functioned as its constant life support system. Think of the annual rhythm of grinding labor. As soon as the brief northern summer arrived, you weren't just celebrating the sun, you were crawling up top. Waterlogged or frost-damaged sections of turf had to be cut out and replaced like surgical skin grafts. Fragile, waterproof layers of birch bark underneath needed inspection for rot and tears. This wasn't a build-it-and-forget-it system. It was an ongoing exchange. You had to read the wood like a sailor reads the sea. A beam doesn't fail silently overnight. It talks. It groans with a different pitch when the fibre starts to crush. In the smoke-dried loft of a Norse longhouse, a new cold draft wasn't just discomfort, it betrayed a shifting seam letting in snowmelt. A single dark drip against a soot-blackened rafter signalled a nascent leak that, left ignored through a 3-day blizzard, would soak the insulation mat and triple the dead load in hours. You trained your children to spot these things. Ignoring a subtle warning wasn't a minor oversight. It was an invitation for a slow, wet collapse that could entomb everyone in their sleep. And sometimes you couldn't wait for summer. If a legendary storm settled over the fjord, piling snow into drifts taller than a man, every available body dropped their tools and climbed the ladder. They used wide wooden scoops to clear the snow before it compressed into ice, a bonded enemy that adhered like stone. What you're seeing here isn't just medieval architecture, it's a brutally honest relationship. Any brilliant timber framing or turf roof design would be a pile of compost and splinters in 2 seasons without this. The real load-bearing structure wasn't just the timber inside the walls. It was the constant, aching, labour-intensive vigilance of the people who called the Longhouse a home. But that vigilance had a brutal ceiling, a hard limit where knowledge and muscle simply lost the fight against Nordic physics. We have to be honest about the times the roof did fail, because the archaeological record is riddled with evidence of catastrophic collapse. Picture a midwinter thaw that turns a metre of powder into a dense, slushy sponge right on your ridge beam, only for a bitter east wind to flash freeze the entire mess into a solid ice crust by dawn. That crust didn't just add tons of dead weight, it sealed the drainage and locked the meltwater right inside the turf layers. A turf roof already weighed close to 5 tons, add a crystallized glacier on top, and you're talking about an unimaginable load pressing down on the king posts. You'd hear the timber start to shriek, a high-pitched, groaning sound that meant a core fibre inside a main post was on the verge of splitting. And when a supersaturated, rain-soaked load finally snapped a load-bearing beam, it wasn't a slow sag, it was an explosive, splintering gunshot in the dark that brought the whole frozen mat of earth crashing onto the hearth. The danger was often invisible long before that loud crack, particularly when it came to rot. The entire smoke-drying system relied on a perfect envelope, but a single breached seam in the birch bark layer was a death sentence. A trickle of moisture would hit a timber joint where no smoke draft could reach, and a fungal infection would spread quietly, eating the heart out of a corner post while the outer surface looked solid. For a small family or an aging household with no strong backs left to scrape the upper ridge during a heavy storm, the math was unforgiving. We found collapsed Norse longhouse sites where burnt beams mixed with clay, likely from a desperate fire lit too high when the cold became lethal. Survival wasn't about some magical building technique. It was a pure probability game managed by sheer, grinding effort, where the skill of the original timber framer and the daily diligence of the inhabitants tipped the scales against a roof hungry for gravity. Now, step back and see the whole machine. The Viking roof endured heavy snow not because of one clever trick, but because steep pitch, heavy timber framing, layered turf, internal smoke drying, and obsessive maintenance formed a single survival system. Think back to that opening storm scene, the longhouse groaning under fresh load, the fire crackling, the family listening. That groan wasn't a warning of collapse. It was the sound of a load-bearing structure talking back. The steep pitch shed snow, channeling weight down into massive beams. Those timbers, often ship-grade oak, flexed without snapping. Above them, the turf roof wasn't just dead grass. Those layered sod blocks acted as a living root membrane, locking the surface tight. Inside, the ever-burning fire pushed heat upward, smoke drying the wooden skeleton, hardening it against rot. Add meticulous drainage carved into the eaves and relentless maintenance, relaying turf every spring. checking pegs, clearing meltwater paths, and you see the truth. This was ancient construction as dynamic weather machine. In medieval Scandinavia, a roof was never a static object. It was applied environmental engineering demanding full-time participation from its inhabitants. And that's exactly why these structures endured. It wasn't just clever timber framing or a heavy turf roof. It was a living, breathing partnership, intelligent design matched with relentless human vigilance. Medieval architecture wasn't about static strength. Norse longhouses survived bitter winters because vigilant house maintenance was survival itself. Smoke drying the roof, shoveling snow, watching for sag. This was a load-bearing discipline, not just load-bearing structure. So, what ancient technology do you want Nolan to unpack next? Drop a comment. Which forgotten engineering trick fascinates you most? Subscribe and ring the bell if you haven't already. We cover Viking life, Scandinavian buildings, and ancient construction genius. Don't miss what's coming. Stay curious and keep your roof clear. I'm Nolan. This is Just Vikings. Skål.